fold those shirts faster, wage slave! The district manager sneered. I stopped folding the cheap, starchy denim. I quit, I said, my voice cutting through the store's artificial hum. Jared's face turned a violent shade of plum. You can't quit, it's Black Friday! He panicked, spittle flying from his thin lips. I can. I smiled, feeling the cold weight of the keys in my pocket. Because I own the building lease. And I'm closing the store for renovation. Right now. Jared froze, his mouth hanging open. The air inside the mall smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. It was exactly 6 in the morning. Outside the security gates, a restless horde of shoppers pressed against the glass. They looked like a single, breathing organism fueled by discounts. Jared stepped toward me, his shiny suit catching the harsh fluorescent glare. He looked like a man who had never been told no. I felt the vibration of the industrial heaters deep in my teeth. The power dynamic shifted without a single scream. I reached into my ratty tote bag and pulled out a manila envelope. The paper was crisp and heavy. Unlike the flimsy receipts Jared obsessed over daily. I slid the master lease onto the coffee-stained folding table. My name, Maddie Vance, was printed in bold black ink at the top. Jared's eyes darted across the clauses, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. His hands began to shake. He finally realized the woman he called a servant was actually his landlord. The morning light was gray and thin. I remembered the silk blouse hidden beneath my polyester company vest. For months, I had played the part of the invisible seasonal hire. I watched him berate the single mothers and ignore the leaking sewage in the fitting rooms. I documented every safety violation with the precision of a surgeon. The blocked fire exits were my favorite piece of evidence. Jared looked at the crowd outside and then back at me. His arrogance was replaced by terror. A low buzz echoed as I activated the security gate controls. The heavy metal shutters began their slow, rhythmic descent. The noise was a mechanical guillotine, steady and final. Customers outside started shouting, their muffled anger hitting the glass like hail. Jared lunged for the button, but I stepped into his path. I wasn't the tired worker anymore. I was the shark who had been circling his sinking ship for months. He stopped, realizing I wasn't moving. The gate hit the floor. You're destroying my career, Jared whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't feel a flicker of sympathy. I thought about Brittany crying in the break room yesterday. I thought about the stolen overtime pay that funded Jared's fake lifestyle. I reached up and unpinned my plastic name tag, dropping it into a puddle of spilled lat. The plastic clattered against the floor tiles I technically owned. It was the loudest sound in the store. He looked small standing among the towers of messy, overpriced sweaters. The fire marshal appeared at the front entrance right on schedule. Frank didn't look at the clothes. He looked at the obstructed egresses I had reported. He carried a heavy clipboard and wore the expression of a man who loved rules. Jared tried to stammer an excuse about holiday volume, but Frank held up a hand. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The store was officially condemned for immediate emergency repairs. I watched Jared realize there would be no Black Friday bonus. I walked past the empty registers toward the back exit. The silence was beautiful. I peeled off the cheap vest and let it fall onto a pile of clearance shirts. My Range Rover was waiting in the private lot across the street. I didn't look back at the shuttered storefront or the ruined man clutching his clipboard. The renovation wouldn't just fix the plumbing and the wiring. It would clear out the rot. I put on my sunglasses as the cold rain began. The cold rain felt like needles against my skin as I crossed the asphalt. I climbed into the Range Rover and let the engine hum to life. My hands were steady, but my heart hammered against my ribs. 6 months of playing the fool had finally reached its peak. I looked at the mall entrance through the blurred windshield. The metal gates were down. But the war was just beginning. Jared would call corporate within minutes. He was a cornered rat with a phone. I drove toward the downtown office where my real life lived. The mahogany desk and glass walls felt alien after months of retail dust. My attorney, David, was already waiting with a steaming cup of tea. He didn't ask how it went. He saw the fire in my eyes and opened the master file. "They're already calling Maddie," he said quietly. The trendy executives were scrambling to understand how a seasonal hire could lock them out. They still hadn't read the fine print. I leaned back and watched the rain streak the high-rise windows. "Let them call," I replied, my voice cold and sharp. They ignored the sewage leaks and the blocked exits for years. Now they can pay the rent on a store they can't even enter. David nodded, his pen scratching against the legal pad. We had the evidence, the photos, and the fire marshal's report. Jared was a small piece of a much larger rot. The corporation was the real beast I wanted to cage. My phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating like an angry insect. It was an unknown number from a local area code. I answered without hesitating. Jared's voice was a frantic, high-pitched mess on the other end. "You think you're smart, Maddie," he hissed. "I know people. I'll tell everyone you sabotaged the store." I smiled at the ceiling. He was projecting his own crimes onto me. It was pathetic. I didn't say a word. I simply hung up and blocked him forever. The realization hit me that Brittany was still inside the mall corridor. She had no idea I was the one who signed her checks. I had promised to take care of the staff, and I intended to keep it. I messaged David a list of names and banking details. "Pay them triple for the day," I instructed. "Tell them it's a landlord compensation fund." I wanted Jared to be the only one who lost everything. The workers were just collateral in his ego trip. David looked up from his tablet with a worried frown. "There is one complication, Maddie," he noted. "The corporate legal team is claiming the renovation clause is predatory." I laughed at the irony. A billion-dollar company was complaining about unfairness. They had signed the lease because I offered them a discount. They chose greed over due diligence. Now they were trapped in a cage of their own making. I told David to send the video of Jared screaming at the staff. The video was a masterpiece of corporate self-destruction. In the footage, Jared called me a bottom feeder while kicking a fire extinguisher out of the way. It showed the systematic abuse of the very people who generated their profit. No judge would side with a company that allowed such filth to manage their assets. The subtext was clear: Trenzy was a liability to the mall. I wasn't just a landlord. I was the one cleaning up a public safety nightmare. By noon, the rain had turned into a thick, gray fog. The corporate offices of Trenzy sent an urgent settlement offer. They wanted to surrender the lease quietly, if I agreed not to release the footage. It was a cowardly move, but I expected nothing less. I looked at the signature line on the document. I could end this now and move on. But I wanted more than just a vacant store. I wanted a public admission of their gross negligence. I stood up and smoothed my tailored blazer. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the wage slave folding starchy jeans in the dark. I was the woman who controlled the ground beneath their feet. Tell them no, I said to David. We go to court. Or they pay the staff's salaries for a full year. He looked surprised, then he grinned. The game had changed again. I walked out of the office feeling the weight of a new secret. The fog clung to the office glass like a damp shroud. I watched David dial the corporate line. My objective was simple: force a total surrender. The Trenzy lawyers were aggressive. Their voices sharp through the speakerphone. They threatened to tie the property up in litigation for a decade. I checked my watch while they blustered. The pressure was high, but I held the cards. I tapped the mahogany desk with a steady rhythm. They didn't know I had a second witness ready to come forward tonight. A heavy silence followed my counter offer. The lead attorney for Trenzy cleared his throat, sounding less confident now. We can't pay a year of salaries, Maddie, he argued. I looked at the spreadsheet on my monitor. The cost was a fraction of their quarterly marketing budget. They were choosing to fight over pennies, while their reputation bled out. I leaned into the microphone. Then we let the local news see the sewage footage, I said. The power balance shifted instantly. They were finally listening to the consequences. The turn came when a new email popped up on my screen. It was an anonymous tip from an internal corporate account. Someone in their accounting department was watching the fall. They attached a PDF showing Jared's embezzlement went much higher than the store level. He was funneling money into a shell company, owned by a regional VP. This wasn't just a rogue manager, it was a systemic criminal enterprise. I shared the screen with David. He whistled low. The leverage we had was now lethal. We need a moment to confer, the lawyer whispered. The line went dead with a soft click. I stood up and paced the length of the office. My reflection in the glass looked sharp and dangerous. I wasn't just a landlord protecting a building anymore. I was a whistleblower about to crack open a multi-state fraud ring. My hands gripped the back of my leather chair. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The air in the room felt electric. I was winning more than a lease. The office door opened, and David's assistant rushed in with a frantic look. She handed me a printed tablet. A social media video was going viral. It wasn't the footage I had filmed. Someone else had recorded the Black Friday evacuation from the crowd's perspective. The video showed Jared lunging at a customer before the fire marshal intervened. It had 1 million views in 3 hours. The public was already judging Trenzy. The pressure was no longer private. It was a global PR disaster. They want to settle everything, David said, his voice brimming with excitement. The corporate team was back on the line, sounding desperate. They agreed to the full year of salaries for every employee. They also agreed to vacate the premises by midnight without a fight. It was a total victory on paper. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt a strange coldness in my chest. I knew Jared wouldn't go quietly. He had too much to lose. He was still out there. I left the office as the sun began to set behind the skyscrapers. The city lights flickered to life in the deepening purple sky. I drove back toward the mall, wanting to see the empty space myself. The Range Rover felt like a fortress against the cold wind. I thought about Brittany and the others. They would be safe now. Financially secure for months. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed something wrong. Jared's beat-up sedan was parked near the loading dock. The mall was officially closed, but the service entrance was propped open with a brick. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped into the shadows. The smell of floor wax was gone, replaced by something acrid and metallic. I moved silently toward the trendy storefront. The security gate was still down, but the lights inside were flickering wildly. I saw a shadow moving behind the denim wall. Someone was inside the store despite the condemnation. I realized I had left the master key in the office. I reached for my phone, but a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. The air was knocked out of my lungs. I smelled cheap peppermint vape juice and stale energy drinks. Jared's voice hissed into my ear, hot and wet. "You think you can take my life, Maddie?" He growled. I struggled, but he was fueled by a manic, desperate strength. He dragged me toward the darkness of the service corridor. I saw the glint of a heavy metal flashlight in his hand. I slammed my elbow back into Jared's ribs with every ounce of my weight. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to twist away. My objective was simple: reach the light switch in the corridor. Jared stumbled, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a manic energy. The service hallway was a narrow throat of concrete and peeling paint. I could hear his heavy boots scuffing the floor as he lunged again. I ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The metal flashlight Jared carried struck the wall beside my head. Sparks flew as the casing dented the plaster. He wasn't just angry, he was completely unhinged. I looked for a weapon, but found only plastic wrap and cardboard. The pressure of the confined space made the air feel thin. "You ruined it all," he roared, his voice echoing off the cold stone. I didn't reply because I needed to save my breath. I had to outsmart him in the dark. Silence was my only shield. I moved toward the electrical closet, remembering the floor plan from my audit. If I could cut the power to the entire wing, I could escape in the confusion. Jared was swinging the flashlight like a club, its beam cutting wild arcs through the gloom. I reached the heavy iron handle of the closet door. My fingers fumbled with the latch in the shadows. I felt the cold steel bite into my palm. Just as the door clicked open, the light found me. Jared laughed. "Going somewhere, landlord?" he sneered, closing the distance between us. He raised the heavy light, but I didn't flinch. I reached inside the closet and grabbed the fire extinguisher instead. I pulled the pin with a sharp, metallic snap. Before he could strike, I squeezed the lever. A thick cloud of white chemical powder exploded into his face. He choked, dropping the flashlight as he stumbled backward. The power balance shifted in a single, choking breath. I grabbed his flashlight from the floor. The powder hung in the air like a ghostly fog. Jared was on his knees, coughing violently and rubbing his eyes. I stood over him, the flashlight beam pinned on his chest. I felt a surge of cold clarity. "The police are already on their way, Jared," I said quietly. I had triggered the mall's silent alarm when I forced the closet door. He looked up, his face covered in white dust. He looked pathetic. The monster was just a small man in a cheap suit. The sirens began as a distant wail against the building's exterior. Jared tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He looked at the open service door, then back at me. "They'll find the money," he whispered, his voice trembling now. He wasn't talking about the embezzlement I had uncovered. He was talking about something else entirely. I realized he had been moving physical cash into the store's walls. The renovation wouldn't just find mold. It would find a hidden fortune. This was his true secret. I watched the red and blue lights begin to flash against the corridor walls. The mall security team arrived first, followed quickly by the city police. They found us in the haze of the fire suppressant. I handed the flashlight to a tall officer and stepped back. My blazer was ruined, but I felt lighter than I had in years. They cuffed Jared and led him away toward the loading dock. He didn't look back at the store. He only looked at the ground. As the flashing lights painted the wet pavement red and blue, the lead detective walked over to me, checking a note on his digital tablet. "We found a hole in the drywall behind the registers, Ms. Vance," he said. My heart skipped a beat as I followed him back into the store. Beneath the flickering neon sign, the wall had been ripped open. Stacks of bundled $100 bills were stuffed into the insulation. This wasn't just retail fraud. This was a professional laundering operation. Jared had been a puppet for a much larger organization. I felt a chill. I sat on a concrete planter outside as the investigators worked. The rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot looking like a dark mirror. I had saved the store and protected the employees, but the danger was evolving. If Jared was laundering money for a cartel, my face was now on their radar. I looked at the Range Rover and realized I couldn't go home tonight. The victory felt hollow as a black SUV pulled into the lot. It didn't have police markings, it just watched. The black SUV sat idle, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing police strobes. I gripped my phone, my objective clear: get to a secure location without being followed. The pressure intensified as the police began wrapping yellow tape around the loading dock. I couldn't ask them for help without revealing the laundering evidence I still held on my personal server. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements fluid and calm. Every shadow in the parking lot felt like a threat. My skin prickled with a sudden, icy sweat. I walked toward the Range Rover, my heels clicking on the wet asphalt. The SUV's engine roared to life, a low growl that vibrated in my chest. I didn't look back as I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the ignition. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot, checking every mirror. The SUV followed, maintaining a steady, haunting distance behind me. I was being hunted by professionals, not a petty manager. The city streets were empty and slick with late night rain. I turned into a crowded gas station to test my pursuer. The black SUV slowed down but didn't enter the bright, fluorescent lot. This was the mid-scene turn. They weren't looking for a confrontation yet. They were tracking my destination. I realized they didn't know I had a second property, downtown with a secure underground garage. I pulled back onto the road, accelerating through a yellow light. The chase was silent, psychological, and deadly. I navigated through a maze of narrow alleyways near the warehouse district. The SUV was persistent, hanging back like a ghost in the fog. I needed to lose them before I reached my safe house. I took a sharp left, then killed my headlights as I ducked into a dark loading bay. I watched the black vehicle pass by, its brake lights glowing like angry red eyes. My breath hitched in my throat. I waited for 5 long minutes in the absolute darkness. Once the road was clear, I drove toward my downtown loft. The garage door opened with a heavy, mechanical rumble. I pulled inside and watched the steel barrier slide shut, sealing me away from the world. I sat in the silence of the car for a long time. The realization hit me that I was no longer just a landlord. I was a witness to something that could dismantle a cartel. I felt a strange mixture of terror and fierce resolve. I headed upstairs and immediately opened my encrypted laptop. The files I had gathered undercover contained more than just Jared's petty theft. I found a hidden ledger buried in the store's digital inventory system. It listed hundreds of transactions that made no sense for a retail chain. Huge sums were moving through the store every Friday like clockwork. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. I started uploading the data to a secure cloud server. This was my insurance policy against the black SUV. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown contact. It was a single photo of my front door, at the gated community. My heart stopped. They knew where I lived, but they hadn't broken in yet. It was a warning to keep my mouth shut about the money in the walls. They didn't care about Jared or the lease. They only cared about the bundles of cash the police were currently counting. I was standing in the middle of a massive crossfire. I called David, my lawyer, but his line went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like him. Especially on a night this volatile. I looked at the security feed for my loft and saw a man standing by the elevator. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in tactical gear. He looked directly into the camera and held up a badge. It wasn't a police badge. It was federal. The situation was spiraling far beyond my control. I stood up and backed away. The elevator chimed, the sound echoing through the open floor plan. I grabbed a heavy glass carafe from the kitchen island, my only weapon. The doors slid open, revealing the man from the monitor. He didn't draw a gun. He simply held out a hand. "Ms. Vance. We've been watching you since the lease was signed," he said. I lowered the glass, my mind racing to catch up. He stepped into the light, revealing a face I recognized from the news. This was the complication. The man in the elevator was Special Agent Miller, a name I had seen on federal news feeds regarding the Tree State Task Force. He stepped into my loft with a practiced, predatory grace. My objective was to secure my freedom without becoming a permanent asset to his investigation. I felt the cold air from the garage draft up behind him. He held his badge steady, his eyes scanning my defensive posture. He didn't look like he was here to arrest me. He looked like he was here to negotiate a surrender. Miller gestured toward my open laptop on the kitchen island. "You've done a remarkable job, Maddie. Most landlords don't go undercover to audit their tenants," he said. The pressure in the room was stifling, a physical weight on my shoulders. I didn't move toward the laptop. I kept the glass carafe gripped tight in my right hand. He was too calm for a man who had just bypassed my high-end security system. I realized my encrypted servers were likely already compromised by his team. He was 3 steps ahead of me. I set the glass down on the marble counter with a sharp click. "If you've been watching me, you know about the money in the walls," I said. My voice was steady, masking the tremor in my chest. Miller nodded, his expression remaining neutral. He pulled a small tablet from his tactical vest and swiped through a series of photos. They weren't from the store. They were surveillance shots of the black SUV that had followed me home. The federal agents were the ones driving it. I had been running from the law. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The SUV wasn't the cartel. It was Miller's team protecting the evidence I was carrying. The power balance shifted as he slid the tablet toward me. Jared was just a middleman for a massive laundering ring. We needed him to crack, Miller explained. But then he showed me a detail that changed everything. There was a photo of my attorney, David, meeting with a regional executive from Trenzy. David wasn't just my lawyer. He was working for the other side. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Every legal move I had made was being reported back to the very people I was trying to dismantle. David had suggested the mall purchase. He had facilitated the lease. I wasn't the shark, I was the bait. Miller watched me process the betrayal. He didn't offer comfort. He only offered a choice. Give us the final encryption key to the ledger, he demanded. Or we let David know you've already talked to us. He was using my life as leverage. I looked at the digital ledger on my screen. It was a map of corporate rot that spanned across the entire country. If I gave it to Miller, the investigation would go public. David would be ruined. But so would I. My reputation as a discreet, real estate mogul would vanish. I would be a target for every person named in those files. The pressure was a tightening vise around my throat. I had to decide if my integrity was worth my safety. I reached for the keyboard with trembling fingers. The turn came when I noticed a specific account number in the ledger's bottom row. It wasn't a corporate account. It was a private trust fund registered in my own name. I hadn't opened it. David, using his power of attorney, must have been funneling illegal cash into my accounts for years. They weren't just laundering money through my building. They were making me the fall girl for the entire operation. If the feds raided the store, the trail of breadcrumbs led directly to my door. I was the primary suspect in a federal crime. I didn't do this. I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time. Miller didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. We know you didn't, Maddie. But a jury won't see it that way without your cooperation, he replied. He was giving me an out. But it was a trap of its own. I had to become an informant to save my own skin. I looked at the dark windows of my loft. The city felt like a vast, hungry machine waiting to grind me into dust. I felt completely and utterly alone. I typed the final encryption key into the prompt. The ledger unfolded like a blooming flower of red and black data. Names, dates, and offshore accounts scrolled past in a frantic blur. Miller leaned in, his face illuminated by the blue light of the monitor. He looked like a hunter who had finally caught his prey. He didn't care about the people I had saved. He only cared about the conviction. I felt a surge of cold, focused anger. I wasn't going to be anyone's puppet. I stood up and walked toward the window. The black SUV was still parked in the shadows of the alleyway below. I could see the silhouette of a driver waiting for a signal. I turned back to Miller, my resolve hardening into something sharp. I'll give you everything, I said. But I want immunity in writing. And I want David arrested tonight. Miller hesitated, then reached for his radio. He was making the call. I had successfully traded my secrets for a chance at a new life. The tactical team moved with silent efficiency. They exited the elevator and began securing the files from my laptop. Miller stayed by my side, watching the data transfer progress bar. He seemed almost bored now that the hunt was over. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 a.m. The longest day of my life was finally winding down. But as the last file uploaded, the power in the building suddenly cut out. We were plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. I heard the heavy thud of a flashbang exploding in the hallway. The shockwave shattered the kitchen windows, showering the floor in glass. Miller pulled his weapon, but he was blinded by the sudden burst of light. I dropped to the floor, crawling toward the safety of the marble island. Shadows moved through the shattered window frames. These weren't federal agents. They were wearing the same tactical gear, but they moved with a different, more violent intent. The cartel had arrived to clean up the mess. I felt a hand grab my ankle and pull me out from under the counter. I kicked out wildly, my heel connecting with something hard and metallic. A voice whispered a name I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't Jared. It was the CEO who had fired me via Zoom a decade ago. He stood over me, silhouetted by the city lights. He held a suppressed pistol aimed at Miller's head. "You always were too smart for your own good, Maddie," he sneered. The nightmare was no longer about a mall. The cold steel of the pistol barrel pressed against Agent Miller's temple. I stared at Robert, the CEO who had once crushed my spirit with a single mouse click. My objective was survival, but my instinct demanded justice. The pressure in the dark room was suffocating, thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder. Robert looked older, his face a map of hidden vices and corporate greed. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was the head of the entire laundering operation. Miller remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow. The world had gone quiet. "You never did know when to stop digging, Maddie," Robert said, his voice a smooth, terrifying silk. He tightened his grip on the weapon. I realized then that my undercover stint at the mall was no accident. They had lured me there to frame me for their crimes. The trust fund, the lease, and Jared were all pieces of a larger trap. I felt a surge of hot, focused rage. I wasn't that broken employee from a decade ago. I was the landlord now. I reached for the Marble Island's edge. My fingers found the heavy glass carafe. The mid-scene turn came from the shadows behind Robert. A laser dot appeared on his chest, dancing across his expensive tailored blazer. It wasn't Miller's team, it was a third party. A muffled shot rang out, and the pistol flew from Robert's hand as he screamed in pain. Miller moved like lightning, tackling Robert to the floor before he could recover. I scrambled back, clutching the carafe as a shield. The power in the building flickered back on. Standing in the doorway was Brittany, holding a compact tactical rifle. She looked professional. "I told you I'd take care of the staff, Maddie," Brittany said, her voice steady and devoid of its usual tremor. She wasn't an assistant manager. She was deep undercover with a different agency. She had been watching Jared, Miller, and me for months. The power balance shifted as she secured the room with two other silent operators. Miller stood up, wiping blood from his lip. He looked at Brittany with a mix of respect and annoyance. They were from rival departments. I was caught between two federal giants. Robert groaned on the floor, his hand shattered by the precise shot. Brittany didn't offer him any medical attention. She walked over to my laptop and checked the data transfer. "The ledger is safe," she noted, looking at me with a soft, knowing smile. I felt a strange sense of betrayal mixed with relief. My friend was a lie, but her protection was real. She had let me take the risks to flush Robert out. The pressure began to lift, but the room still felt like a cage. I was still a suspect. Miller and Brittany began arguing over jurisdictional control of the evidence. Their voices were sharp, staccato bursts of acronyms and legal threats. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I looked at the shattered windows and the city lights. The sun was finally beginning to rise over the skyline. It was the color of a bruised peach. I realized that neither agency truly cared about my safety. I was a witness to be processed and filed away. I needed to find a way to exit their game. My mind started racing. "I want my immunity signed now," I interrupted, my voice cutting through their bickering. I looked at both agents with a cold, unwavering stare. I held the encryption key in my head. The only thing they didn't have. If they wanted the offshore accounts, they needed me. Miller hesitated, then pulled a digital stylus from his vest. He signed the electronic form on his tablet and handed it to Brittany. She added her own digital signature. I was legally clear. But I wasn't finished with Robert. I walked toward the man. Robert looked up at me, his eyes full of a desperate, flickering hatred. "You'll never be one of us, Maddie." He spat. I leaned down, my face inches from his. I thought about the thousands of lives his laundering had ruined. I thought about the mall and the people who just wanted a fair paycheck. "I don't want to be one of you," I replied. "I just want to be the one who takes your world away." I handed Brittany the final key. The screen turned green. It was finally over. The federal teams began clearing the loft, moving with a clinical, robotic speed. They loaded Robert into a secure transport vehicle, while Miller coordinated the media blackout. Brittany stayed behind for a moment, looking at the mess of glass and broken furniture. "The bookstore idea was good, Maddie," she said quietly. "You should keep it." I nodded, feeling the weight of the night finally catching up to me. I was exhausted, bruised, and alone. But I was free. I watched her leave with the other silent tactical operators. I sat on the kitchen floor and watched the morning light fill the room. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I looked at my hands, which were stained with white fire suppressant dust and Robert's blood. I had won the war, but the cost was written in the ruins of my home. I thought about the bookstore and the employees who were now millionaires. I had kept my promise to them. That was the only thing that mattered. I felt a tear. The elevator chimed one last time, making me jump. I gripped the carafe, my knuckles white. The doors opened to reveal David, my lawyer. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked and his eyes wide with fear. He saw the police tape and the shattered glass. He saw me sitting on the floor. He didn't say a word as he walked toward me. He looked like a man who knew he was about to be arrested. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was my father's journal. "They took everything from me, Maddie," David whispered, his voice trembling. He handed me the book, his fingers shaking against the leather. "I didn't want to betray you. They threatened my family." I took the journal, feeling the familiar texture of the cover. It was the only thing I had left of my past. I looked at the man who had been my only friend for a decade. He was a coward, but he was a human one. I realized then that the rot went deeper than just corporate greed. It was personal. I stood up and looked at the notebook, then at the elevator. 2 officers were already standing there, waiting for him. David didn't fight as they took his arms. He only looked at me with a deep, hollow shame. I watched the doors close on the last piece of my old life. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The mall would reopen soon, but I wouldn't be there. I had a new building to buy. The landlord was finally coming home to herself. The morning sun turned the broken glass into diamonds across the floor. I opened my father's journal and found a single, yellowed photograph tucked inside the back cover. It showed a young, smiling Maddie standing in front of a small hardware store. That was the business, Vance's hardware, that Robert had stolen 40 years ago. I finally understood that this war began long before I was born. My objective was no longer just survival or profit. I needed to reclaim my family's stolen legacy. The air felt heavy with old ghosts. I walked through the empty loft, my boots crunching on the debris. The federal agents had cleared out, leaving me with a haunting silence. I looked at the digital ledger one last time before deleting the local copy. All the names of the conspirators were now in federal hands. My secret was out, but my leverage remained high. I had outlived the predator who tried to bury me. I felt a strange sense of peace. The corporate beast was finally dead. I was the victor. 3 months later, the mall corridor hummed with a different energy. The sterile scent of floor wax was replaced by the aroma of fresh roasted coffee beans. I stood before the storefront where Trenzy once stood. A new sign hung above the entrance. The Anchor Books and Collective. The glass was clean and free of aggressive sale posters. I adjusted my blazer and stepped inside. The lighting was warm and inviting. It felt like a sanctuary. I was no longer a ghost in the machine. Brittany was shelving a new shipment of hardcovers near the front window. She looked healthy, her eyes bright with a sense of purpose. She didn't have to carry a rifle today. We shared a quiet look that acknowledged everything we had endured in the dark. I didn't ask about her agency work, and she didn't ask about my father's journal. We were just two women running a business now. She handed me a cup of espresso. The steam felt warm against my face. I noticed a man standing near the mall directory through the large window. He wore an oversized yellow vest that said, "Survey Taker," in faded letters. It was Jared. His face was sallow. And his once precious hair was a tangled mess. He held a plastic clipboard with trembling hands. Shoppers walked past him as if he were made of air. He was the bottom feeder now, invisible and desperate. He looked at the bookstore but didn't see me watching him. I felt nothing but cold indifference. A young girl ran into the store, her laughter echoing through the tall shelves. She grabbed a picture book and sat on a soft velvet chair. This was the renovation I had truly wanted. I had traded a laundering hub for a place of knowledge. The staff worked with dignity, earning wages that actually paid their bills. I had kept every promise made in those dark corridors. The mall was thriving under a new philosophy. I felt the weight of the past finally lift away. I sat in the small office at the back of the bookstore. My father's journal was open on the desk, next to a new lease agreement. This time, I wasn't the landlord hiding in the shadows. My real name was on the deed, and my intentions were clear. I had dismantled a cartel and built something beautiful from the ruins. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at the black and white photo. I had finally won the store back for us. I smiled. My phone vibrated on the desk with a sharp, insistent ring. I saw a restricted number and hesitated before answering. A voice I didn't recognize spoke a single, chilling sentence. "The ledger you gave them was incomplete, Ms. Vance." My heart stopped as I looked at the encrypted file on my screen. There was a hidden partition I had missed. The names on the new list weren't corporate executives or cartel thugs. They were politicians. The game hadn't ended. It had simply moved to a higher floor.